So I love the P320 M17. I have two of them. This is my M17 right here, and I've got my P320 back here. And I have close to 10,000 rounds between the two variants that I have. I even jokingly call myself your local Sig fanboy because of how much I really like this pistol. This video is going to be scripted, so it's going to be a little bit less out of pocket or stream of conscious that my other videos are. Let me know if you guys like this sort of style better, or if you think I should go back to just kind of saying what it pops into my head at the time. Also, remember to like and subscribe, comment, because comments are literally the most important thing for the algorithm. So let me know what you guys think. So my first P320 was this one. This is the P320X Carry, and it came with 2 frames and then a compact slide. This black frame that I currently have with it is compatible with 15 round magazines flush fit. And then this tan frame that I have back here is flush fit with a 17 round magazine. So you have a sort of Glock 19 in this one with the compact slide and compact frame. And then with the tan frame, you have a Glock 19X, essentially. So I bought this gun because I wanted to upgrade from my then concealed carry gun, which was a Smith & Wesson M&P Shield, the first generation of shields. So it had 7 rounds plus 1 in the chamber, and it was heavy and it had a really bad trigger. So when I was looking at guns that I wanted to upgrade to, I had a couple of requirements. The first requirement was that it had to have a minimum capacity of 15. The second requirement was that it had to have an optics cut. The third requirement was that it had to be a modern pistol. It couldn't have been something that was, an older design like the Smith & Wesson M&P Shield. So with all of those requirements in mind, ultimately my decision came down between the P320 and the Glock 19. I ended up going with the P320 because it was slightly thinner and it had more modularity, and then it also had the slightly more modern flat face trigger, which I now realize it doesn't really make that big of a difference, and the differences that it does make are pretty minimal, and I honestly kind of prefer a curved trigger or a hybrid trigger more. Think of the lightning bow on the Geissele SSA X. That type of trigger I slightly prefer, where it has a light curve in it, but that's out of the scope of this video. So ultimately I chose the P320 because I knew I was in the Army at the time, and I knew that training with this would also help with my pistol qualifications. I watched TFB TV at the time and knew how important training with your concealed carry gun was. So I also bought 500 rounds of Ammo Inc. remanufactured ammo, and I bought 2 boxes of 124 grain Federal HSTs. Those first 500 rounds or so were pretty rough. I think it was largely due to the ammo being low quality ammunition, because the Federal HSTs, which is high quality ammunition, all of those cycled perfectly reliable, but with the Ammo Inc. remanufactured ammo, I was getting failure to eject or failure to feed at least once a magazine. So I would take the gun out and shoot about 100 rounds, give or take, and out of that I would get, maybe 10 malfunctions. So I got really good at clearing malfunctions, but it really made me question the reliability of the gun. At the last 100 rounds of that first 500, I had a case head separation. So what happened was the portion of the barrel, let me disassemble the pistol and I'll demonstrate. So I disassembled the barrel, and as you can see, there's a portion of the casing that is not supported by the chamber. This portion was weakened on some of that Ammo Inc. ammo, which resulted in a blowout of that portion of the cartridge. So it wasn't a proper detonation, but I'm sure you've seen pictures of that where it would destroy somebody's frame. So if you're wondering why ammo is blowing up, that's likely why. It's because the casing is either an old or reloaded casing or from a low quality manufacturer. That unsupported portion of the casing exceeds the brass pressure and causes a case head separation. So when I had that case head separation, the only damage that happened to the pistol was that the extractor and the extractor assembly were explosively removed from the pistol. So I didn't trust those parts after they'd been removed in such a fashion. So I just ordered a replacement from Sig for about $30 to $50, somewhere in that range. I don't remember off the top of my head. Installed that, took me about 15 minutes, and the gun has functioned perfectly reliably since. I switched to only shooting high quality ammo out of it. So no more remanufactured ammo. Typically these days I shoot Blazer Brass 115 grain for like my practice ammo. Sometimes I'll shoot 124 or 147 if I'm feeling spicy though. The only other issue that I've had with this gun is the gun won't lock back on the final round. So you'll fire the final round and the slide will just return to battery. That's more of a grip issue than anything else, but we'll get into it later. So long as we're talking about exploding P320s, we should probably talk about the accusations that P320s explode. I have carried this P320 every day for the last 3 years, and I've never had a negligent discharge. I've crashed my bike on this and landed on the rear of the frame and never had a negligent discharge. The reason why is because I use a quality holster and I practice good firearm safeties. I'm well trained and proficient with my firearm. I don't do things like wrapping it up in a towel and throwing it into a gym bag without a holster on it. You know, I also don't put my finger on the trigger when I'm not meaning to shoot it. Cops. Sorry, something stuck in my throat, I think. So the holster that I'm using here is a Black Arch Entrada. They're based out of Logan, Utah. It's a pretty standard sidecar holster, but their customer service has been really great, so I recommend the holster. So let's get a little bit more into the nitty gritty. Like I said, this is a P320 X carry, so it's got compact frame, compact slide. The X carry is actually this grip module, which is the 17 round grip module. Think a Glock 19X. This one is the compact grip module, so think a Glock 19. That's really the only difference between the two grip modules. Since I've got it, I put a Romeo Zero Pro on the top here. That's our optic that we have here. Since this one has the R2 cut, you are required to remove the iron sights in order to put a optic on it. With the iron sights on, it looks like that. This is the M17 cut, but it's functionally identical. A little side note here about the Romeo Zero Pro. Don't buy it. It is not worth your money. Buy something on the Pro Optics cut that is more high quality. The only reason I have this one still on here is because I can't afford to replace it right now, and it's better than having nothing. But like I said earlier, it does cause your iron sights to be lost, but it has a little nitride line in there, plus these two small iron sights. Big quotations around that. They're not very accurate. The biggest issue I have with this is its polymer construction, the hex bolt sighting in system. So it's adjusted using hex bolts here and here on the side. And those hex bolts don't have any clicks to them, so you have no idea how much you're moving your optic. This is similar to like the Romeo Zero. The issue that I've had, and this has been torque to spec, the spec that I got from Sig. My first one, the hex screws that adjust the sight stripped, and I could no longer adjust the sight at all. And these ones are bottomed out, and if I wanted to zero it for any further than 15 yards, I wouldn't be able to because it's bottom out and it's still shooting a little bit to the high and a little bit left. So it's probably 2 MOA high and left at 25 yards. So if I want to shoot past 25 yards with the Romeo Zero optic, I functionally can't because of the optic, which, granted, how much are you going to be shooting outside of 25 yards with a pistol? I like to have all of my pistols zeroed for 25 yards, capable of shooting out to 100 yards. This pistol here, my M17, with the Romeo 1 Pro on it, is capable of making shots out to 100 and is zeroed at 25 yards. So it's something that Sig is capable of. It's just that optic is not worth the money. It's not, they're not putting enough effort into the construction of that optic to make a functional combat optic. Also, it has a plastic lens rather than a glass lens, and then a plastic housing rather than a glass housing, or a metal housing, aluminum or whatever. And then they give you this little shroud to try and protect it. I don't think that's super functional, and I don't trust it very much. Like I said, the only reason I still have it on there is because it's a red dot and it's better than no red dot. So let's talk a little bit about the construction of this gun. So you have a 3.9 inch barrel, 5.3 inch tall from the base to the sights, and you have a 1.3 inch grip. Like I said earlier, this is the old version of the slide that has the removable R2 mounting hardware. The newer versions of the slide, this is the Pro slide here, and as you can see, it's got dovetail sights on it, so even when you're mounting a optic on it, you don't lose your rear and iron sight, which I much prefer. So if you're going to buy a Sig, make sure you look out for the Pro series slide rather than the slide series that has the R2 cut. So like I alluded to, this is my M17. As you can see, I've replaced quite a bit from the original M17 hardware. So I replaced the slide that we have here. That's the original M17 slide. I replaced that with the Pro Cut slide so I could have suppressor height sights and an optic on there at the same time, because the M17 pistol optic hadn't come out at the time, the enclosed pistol optic. I wanted to go for this so that I could keep those backup sights. The next thing I replaced was the grip module. I replaced that with the Wilson Combat grip module, as you can see. And then I replaced the trigger from the stock trigger to the Pro Series trigger. So it's a slightly better trigger, and it does have that flat texturing, unlike the original M17 trigger. So like I said earlier, I have the Romeo 1 Pro on the top here, and as you can see, it's got a couple of dinks on there from taking out in training. I actually prefer the Romeo 1 Pro slightly to the Delta Point Pro, and one of the key reasons behind that is it has push button adjusting for brightness on the side here rather than having to like press that middle button on the Delta Point Pro. It also has a lower optic floor than the Delta Point Pro. The Delta Point Pro is a pretty tall optic. Your sights really need to be suppressor height sights to fit over or even co-witness with the Delta Point Pro. So I do really like the Sig Romeo 1 Pro. It does have a very, very slight blue tint to it, but it's hardly even noticeable unless you're really looking out for it. So it's a really nice optic, especially compared to the Romeo Zero Pro, which has an extreme blue tint to it and all of those issues that I mentioned earlier. So there's a little mini review for you of Sig pistol optics. If you purchase an M17, at minimum, you need to get a different grip frame for it, and you need to get a different trigger for it, because the stock trigger and the stock grip frame are not good at all. I would recommend getting a new slide as well, and then if you get a new slide, you have to get a new barrel, because the stock barrel has a loaded chamber indicator, so it will kick up dust and carbon onto your optic. It's something that's an issue, but it's a small issue, so I haven't gotten around to replacing the barrel on this one yet, because it doesn't impair the function at all. It just means I have to clean the optic more often. When I'm using it, I never notice that, so I don't particularly mind that much. As far as the trigger goes, I've replaced mine with the Pro Series trigger. As you can see, it's got that lightning cut in there. The reason I've done that is because I tried the Gray Ghost triggers. Their triggers are pretty good. The only problem I had with them is, and I don't know if you'll be able to see this, but there's a little piece of metal up in here that blocks stuff from getting inside of your frame. The Gray Ghost triggers don't have that little piece of metal, so their triggers, I think, are more competition oriented rather than duty oriented. You know, my thought process was, if I have that big opening there in my trigger guard, stuff's gonna get up in there and it's gonna jam up all of my internals. So I just went for the Pro Series trigger because it doesn't have that issue. Let's talk about grip frames or grip modules. There's quite a few different grip modules your Sig can come with. So anything from the Wilson Combat to the Spectre series, they're all gonna have different grip modules. The first one was the Gen 1 grip module, and as you can see, this is it right here. You'll know it's the Gen 1 grip module because it has these over insertion tabs right here at the bottom, and then it's got a really fat grip style to it. It's kind of archaic, and then it has these low thumb shelves here on the side. That's really how you'll be able to tell it's a Gen 1 grip module. The next grip module we have are the Gen 2 or the X series grip modules. This is the X series grip module. As you can see, it's got a much more modern styling to it. So you've got a much heavier undercut here for your trigger underneath the trigger guard. You have some slight texturing on the front of the trigger guard here. And then of course you have a much slimmer magwell, a slight amount of integrated flaring for the magwell. And then you can also add more flaring. That's what that hole is there for. You can do a flared magwell extension that you can put on there, or you can do a lanyard. Next we have the Wilson Combat grip frame that I talked about earlier. This Wilson Combat grip frame is perfect. I think this is like the grip module you need to get for all of your SIGs essentially. So as you can see, it's got pretty aggressive texturing throughout here. It's sort of a blend between the Gen 1 where it has this shelf, the thumb shelf, but it's much thinner than the Gen 1, and it has much more aggressive stippling on there. And then it also has a slightly heavier undercut under the beaver tail here. It also has, again, that integrated flared magwell, so you're not going to have to struggle with your reloads as much as something with a straight magwell. But these aren't the only grip modules that you can put on. You can really tailor your P320 to the experience that you want to have based on your grip module. The only thing that really can't change with the grip module is, of course, anything that's on your fire control unit. So your trigger, your safety, if you have one, and then your slide lock and your disassembly lever. Those are all going to stay the same regardless of whether you change your grip module, but there's a ton of different grip modules you can do. Another thing that can't change with your grip module is the grip angle. So your grip angle is going to be the same, and that's just a byproduct of having to work with the magazines. So regardless of which grip frame you get, whichever grip module you get, that angle is always going to stay the same. And we'll talk a little bit about grip angle later. So a minor problem that I do have with the SIGs, and I poked at this earlier, but as you can see, the location of the slide lock is not an ideal position. So it's pretty far out from the slide. As you can see, it sticks out pretty far. You can see it sticks out pretty far. So when you've got your hand in a natural shooting position, your thumb is naturally going to rest right where your slide release is, right? So unless you raise your thumb up like this, you're going to have issues where on the last round, the slide's not gonna block back. And that's just because that's where it's natural to hold your thumb if you're shooting with a modern grip, right? So the reason why that is, my hypothesis at least, is that the and the slide lock were designed at the same time. So if you have your safety there, you have to have that slide lock out a little bit further to be able to access your slide lock. So if I'm on safe, or if I'm using the N17, I can push that slide lock out of the way, and my thumb naturally rests on the slide lock, so I don't have any issues with the slide locking back. And then I still have easy access to the slide lock to release the slide. But if you take the safety away, now the first reference point that you have on your gun is your slide lock. And your slide lock isn't as far forward as it is. Sorry, I've got a blue gun, don't worry about it. Your slide lock isn't as far forward as it is on a Glock, and it's not as recessed as it is on a Glock. And my theory is because the P320 was designed to have a safety with the M17, the slide lock was designed with that safety in mind. So it sticks out further than it probably should and results in the gun not locking back on the final round. So talking a little bit more about the trigger here, we can go ahead and ghost that trigger for you. So your trigger is about 5 pounds. You've got about 1 centimeter of take up before you hit the wall. There's a little bit of squeeze through that wall, and then maybe 0.5 over travel after, and then it'll just push you straight back to that wall and you're good to go again. Let's go ahead and do that with the P320 as well, so you can see that as well. So about 0.5 millimeters to 1 centimeter of take up, the wall, a little bit of mush in the wall, and then you squeeze in through the trigger. You break the wall. I don't know why words are hard. I think the trigger on the P320 is one of the better striker fired triggers that are out there. You know, it's not going to come close to something like a staccato or like a polished Glock, right? Like polished guns or aftermarket parts are always going to be better than stock triggers. But the stock trigger on the M17 P320 is one of the better striker fired triggers that you'll get out of the box. Unless you have that Gen 1, which, like I talked about earlier, the Gen 1s have a lot of problems, so just get an X series, okay? And again, look for that flat face trigger, because if it's the curved trigger, just avoid it. It's about 5 pounds for the trigger pull, which is on par with what Glock advertises, but that flat face trigger gives you a little bit more leverage and makes the trigger feel nicer. So it's got a better trigger overall, in my opinion. Let's talk a little bit about optics mounting, and we touched on this a little bit earlier, but we're just going to rehash and clarify everything. So, like I said earlier, you have 3 potential cuts for your optic, and they're all based off of the Pro cut. So anything that works with a Pro series optic, like the Delta Point Pro or the Sig Pro, those are going to function with this cut. So you have the M17 cut or the R2 cut, and this is when your rear sight is integral to the rear optics cut. And then you have the Pro cut, and that's when you've got these separate dovetail sights. I honestly think that unless you are using the M17 enclosed pistol optic, let's just set this down here. Unless you're using the M17 enclosed pistol optic, using the Pro sights is the move, because it's always better to have an iron sight backup as opposed to no iron sights at all. As much as they want to pretend it does, having a little filament of whatever glow-in-the-dark thing they use does not compare to having proper iron sights. So as reliable as your red dot is, it's a point of failure. And if you follow Thunder Ranch Staff JD, at TR Staff JD on Instagram, he shows all kinds of different expensive red dot sights failing during firing. So having that backup iron sights, for me, is something that is critical in a duty or a carry gun, which is why I'm really gonna replace this top slide soon. We're getting into full-size carry season, so I'll likely just be carrying this, but you know how it is. If you're planning on mounting any other type of optic to these, C&H Precision sells mounting plates that adapt from both the Pro Cut or the R2 cut to basically any optic mounting platform. And they also offer they sell these types of slides, the Pro slides, without having the Pro Cut in them. So they call it their standard slide. You can purchase one of those slides and take it to your gunsmith and have them mill it out to whatever optic you want to have on there. So I'm probably gonna have one taken and milled for the acro footprint, and I might be replacing this, but we'll see. Next up is grip angle. So when you're talking about grip angle, this is gonna affect how the gun recoils in your hand, as well as how you present the firearm. So if I'm presenting, right, with the Sig, as you can see, I've got a basically vertical hand with a slight cant to the rear. Compare that to my Glock blue gun back here. If I present with the Glock, my hand is more angled forward, so my grip angle is a little bit more aggressive compared to the more vertical grip angle on the Sig. So what does this mean? Grip angle is largely preferential, but if you like a 1911 grip angle, the Sig is likely going to be easier to adapt to than a Glock. But if you prefer the Glock grip angle, you already know that you love a Glock, so I don't know why you're watching this video. But grip angle is largely subjective, so take that as you will. Just know that the Sigs have a more vertical grip angle, whereas the Glock has a more aggressive grip angle. The next thing is height over bore. So for those of you that are new to shooting, height over bore is how far over your hands the barrel is and the slide is for pistols. So for a P320, you're going to have a larger height over bore because of the fire control unit. The fire control unit, as a necessity, requires your hands to be lower than it would be on a Glock. See, if you look at how high up my hands are on the Glock, you can see it's almost in line with the bottom part of the slide. Compare that to the P320, and between the webbing of my thumb and the slide, there's maybe a centimeter or so. So you're gonna have a little bit, your recoil impulse is going to be higher up, and that's gonna cause more muzzle flip on the P320 compared to the Glock. So your Glock is likely gonna be a more flat shooting gun than the P320 because of that grip angle and because of the height over bore. Another thing I've seen online recently is that there could be a potential over-insertion problem if you use the X5 or an aftermarket base plate for your magazines. So the magazines have these over-insertion tabs on the bottom here. This is actually functional because it prevents the slide from over-inserting into the gun. And from what I've seen, the X series has an issue where this tab in here, so that tab, when they're inserting the magazine, gets pushed up if they're using like those X5 series magazines or the aftermarket base plates. So I've only used the 20 round magazines, the 30 round magazines that have the Sig base plates, or the 17 and 15 round magazines, which nobody's saying those are a problem. So I can't say whether or not that is an issue with the X5 magazines, or the Legion magazines, I suppose is what they're calling them. I can't necessarily say definitively whether or not that is an issue, but it is something to keep in mind. So if you have those Legion style magazines, it may be worthwhile to purchase your standard magazines and use them instead. What do I really like about the Sig as a platform? The first thing is the serialized fire control unit. So for those of you that don't know, of course everyone should know this by this point, it's not like it's a new gun. The serialized component is not the frame or slide or anything like that. It is the internal component. That means you can change just about everything on this pistol and still have it be the same pistol. Similar to an AR-15 lower. You can swap your uppers, you can swap your stocks, you can swap your grips, you can swap just about anything on it, and it's still the same firearm. That's something I really like about this. Honestly, this is really the AR-15 of pistols because you can swap so much and have it still be the same firearm. If you wanted to get a different grip texture on a Glock, you would have to take it and get it stippled. If you want an aggressive grip texture for a Sig, you can just buy a Wilson Combat grip frame and you're there. It's simple. And there's all these different parts that come from aftermarket retailers that all function and work together, and it's stress-free. So that's something I really like. Sig is really running away with this with their Custom Works program. So for those of you that don't know, Sig has a Custom Works program where you can design your own P320 on their website, and they'll just ship it out to you, and it's got its own special box and everything like that. Another thing that is really awesome about that program is they have their TXG and AXG frames. The TXG and AXG frames have titanium or aluminum in the case of the AXG. So they're metal slides, or metal frames for the P320. So they're going to be heavier. They're going to be slightly more accurate because they're a rigid material. They're more rigid than the original frame is going to be. And they're going to be heavier. So they're likely going to shoot flatter because, physics. A heavier object is harder to move, right? So that's something that is really, really interesting to me as someone who likes firearms as a hobby. If you want something that's more similar to a Glock, but you still want that same serialized internal component, the Springfield Echelon is trying to bring that to market. But I haven't seen aftermarket support for that yet. It's a new gun, so there may be some issues with getting the aftermarket support for it. It depends on how the market reacts to it. So another thing that I really like about the P320 is that they've been very reliable for me. I've heard stories of people who haven't gotten reliable ones, but that has not been my experience at all. I typically don't clean my guns every range trip. I typically clean them every other or every third range trip. So you're looking at 400 to 1,000 rounds between cleanings. And I have never had reliability issues outside of that first 500 rounds with the Ammo Inc. remanufactured ammo that we talked about earlier. That reliability is something that really helps with my confidence in these guns. And then finally, I really like the trigger. The trigger for me is, like I said, one of, if not the best striker fired triggers that you can get out of the box. So that's something that I really like about the Sig. And then if you get a X series or like the Wilson Combat grip frame, that integrally flared magwell is another thing that I really like. If you're shooting USPSA, having that is legal, but if you flare your magwell on a Glock, that's not going to be legal for certain divisions. So, that's something that I really like as well. So let's talk about the good, the bad, and the ugly. The good is the modularity, the reliability, and the trigger. The bad is potential overinsertion problems. I'll have to see more about those to see if there's actually a risk there of damaging your fire control unit. And the height over bore is another problem. And then optics mounting on these is pretty frustrating, especially considering that they use the Pro cut integrally rather than the RMR cut, which I personally prefer the optics that are made for the RMR cut, or different cut that has more availability for mounting plates, something like that. And then the ugly are the Gen 1 P320s. If you have, this is my Sig Air P320, but if you have a Gen 1 lower and a Gen 1 trigger, you've seriously got some problems. So replace those. It's $50 for the Wilson Combat Grip module, and it is far and away better than the Gen 1 grip module. And the archaic triggers on the Gen 1 is another thing that is really bad. Really, just avoid the Gen 1 P320s at all costs. Another thing that is ugly about them is this Sig recall. Typically, if you're purchasing a new P320 at this point, it'll have been a new fire control unit, so you won't have to worry about the recall. But, you know, just check your serial numbers, make sure that it is one that is compliant with the Sig recall for the drop safety. Do I think that Sigs blow up? No, I've not seen any evidence that actually demonstrates that Sigs blow up. And like I've said, I have been riding my bike and crashed pretty hard with that, and it didn't shoot me in the thigh, and I'm not bleeding out somewhere right now because my gun went off without me pulling the trigger. The issue is, just like when Glocks came out, cops aren't training and they're not using proper discipline or clearing their holsters, and then they end up shooting themselves and they try to blame the gun because that's what cops do. So they did it when Glock came out as well. Anyway, that is everything for this review. I'm planning on getting a Glock later this year, so I'm probably going to shoot about 10,000 through that Glock, and then I'll make another video comparing the two and seeing which one I really like better at the end of everything. But this is why I really love my M17 and my P320.